Great, thanks. Both of the previous speakers have said to go to their papers to see the detail of the argument. I would discourage you from going to read mine because I realised that it actually needs to be a lot better. And I realised that after reading papers by Feng Xu and Ollie Lino. So thanks, guys. So I've changed quite a lot in the interim, and hopefully this will make a bit of sense. So what I'm going to be talking about, and part of this paper is actually, I talked about this, some of the ideas in 2016's Philosophy of Games conference, but I'll be moving through those quite rapidly in this context because I want to get to the main idea here, which is this idea of like temporality and the philosophy of temporality as it applies to games through this particular game, Bury Me, My Love. Has anyone heard of this game or played it? Cool. So, is this moving forward? I'm worried about Noor. The last I heard, she'd hitched a ride with a fellow refugee in the car of an Italian woman. I haven't heard anything for hours. It feels really strange being concerned about someone who doesn't exist. So, Noor is the fictional deuteragonist of Bury Me, My Love, a mobile-based game by French creators The Pixel Hunt. The conceit of the game, if we can really call it a game, is that you take the role of Majd, Noor's husband. Majd is looking after ailing family members in the war-torn Syrian city of Homs and is unable to accompany his wife as she leaves to seek refuge in Europe. The pair have invested in smartphones in order to keep in touch, and the PC follows his wife's journey through instant messages in the style of WhatsApp. Along with the subject matter, which presents ethical quandaries and issues not typically dealt with in gaming, Bury Me, My Love incorporates itself into the everyday rhythms of smartphone use. In its so-called real-time mode, which is actually more of a pseudo-real-time mode, the game consists of replying to Noor's instant messages, which pop up with notifications like any other app on your phone. As Majd, you must remotely interact with Noor, much as you would with any other interlocutor, sending texts, emojis, and selfies to advise, cajole, and reassure. Noor is presented as a very free-spirited and self-possessed individual, and part of the game's effectiveness arises from this portrayal. Players can never be quite sure if she will actually end up following their advice. This generates a powerful effect of what we might call modifying Greg Costikyan's notion of narrative anticipation, character-based anticipation. So you're never quite sure whether Noor is going to actually follow you, and I'll talk a bit more about this in a bit. So one of the game's leading creators at the Pixel Hunt is a former journalist called Florent Morin, and he's been careful to distinguish their work from the concept of the news game, which, much like journalism, may be held to, in some sense, report on an event that has occurred in the real world, like a specific event. Instead, when thinking about possible generic classification for his game, and he's written a blog post which is quite interesting about sort of building out what he means by this term reality-inspired, he said this term reality-inspired is a much better kind of classification for what we do. And as one of our PhD students at Abertay University has written, reality-inspired games incorporate genuine stories from the perspective of a few, or encompasses the values of a larger section of those affected by a specific issue. So that's by Robin Millen. For Moran, reality-inspired games involve listening to people, who's a journalist after all, and in this case the game draws on a real report by journalist Lucie Souriere in Le Monde that utilised an interactive presentation to convey the online component of a young Syrian girl named Dana, her journey as she attempted to find refuge in Germany. So neither Majd nor Noor are real people, so much as amalgamations of the many tales that are told by those who have made the crossing being depicted. This is a quote from the game's website. So our two main characters, Noor and Majd, are fictional. They do not exist, or rather they exist collectively. They are a multitude of men, women and children. Dana, her mother, her brother-in-law, as well as thousands of others who fled their country or watched their relatives flee, all in hopes of finding a better life in Europe. End quote. In this paper, I will argue that Bury Me, My Love attempts to give value to refugee lives within the often frenetic interactions and throwaway characterizations of the video game form through this condensation of many stories. One way that it does so is through its temporal structure. I will draw an approach to temporality developed in my recent book that I call chronotypology, as well as the notion of the standard metagame, which I draw from Stephanie Bullock and Patrick Lemieux's 27 book, Metagaming. So, and this is drawing largely on the work of the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben. So this chronotypological method for describing temporal experience draws on Agamben's work, and in particular his essay in Playland. Agamben, drawing on arguments by Levi-Strauss and Emile von Venist, outlines two temporal movements, diachrony and synchrony. And you can kind of that's a page from the book there. I'll kind of build that out a little bit. Synchrony is associated by Levi-Strauss with ritual and the sacred. He argues that it draws two temporal schemes together. His key example is the chiringa in the Aranda culture of Australia, which is a ritual object. A familiar Occidental example would be, and this is moving quite quickly as I said, would be holidays such as Christmas, where nativity scenes recreate or synchronise the events of the past within the lived experience of the present. Agamben supplements this work and in some ways kind of subverts it by noting an opposite temporal movement that he calls diachrony. And some of these terms do pop up in contemporary game design, so we talk about asynchronous multiplayer and stuff like that. If synchrony brings time frames together, diachrony splits them apart. The key example that he gives is play, and indeed this is for him the paradigmatic example. As in Pinocchio, where Playland represents an eternal holiday without the structuring principles of the calendar, time seems to whirl past. However, it is critical to note that for Agamben, neither diachronic play nor synchronic ritual can fully complete their own operations. There is always a material remainder, as can be seen in the sacred chiringa and, for Agamben, the playful toy. Levi-Strauss notes that the sacred object must be carefully secreted away once the ritual ends. So if you think of Black Madonnas and even the Eucharist, it can't just be left lying around, it has to be kind of concealed from view. For Agamben, the toy presents an analogous but opposite transformation when it leaves its own space. And this is a quote: "The toy as a representation of a pure temporal level is undoubtedly a signifier of absolute diachrony, the prior transformation of a structure into an event. But here too, this signifier, once freed, becomes unstable and is invested with the contrary meaning. Here too, at the end of the game, the toy turns around into its opposite and is presented as the synchronic residue which the game can no longer eliminate. For if the transformation were really complete, it would leave no traces and the miniature would have to correspond with its model, just as, at the ritual's termination, the chiringa would have to vanish, corresponding to the body of the individual in whom the ancestor has been reincarnated." End quote. So the toy is like the ritual object insofar as it too is an unstable signifier liable to transform its modality at the limit of a certain procedure. These two embarrassing residues attest as disturbing remainders to the contingency of their own operation, surviving as they do the very spatial temporal toy that they serve to open. The failure of both limit cases, the chiringa and the toy, ritual and play, to complete their respective gestures shows that neither diachrony nor synchrony can ultimately eliminate the other pole. As Agamben writes, the pure event and the pure, absolute diachrony and the pure structure, absolute synchrony, do not exist, at least not within human experience of time. Instead, the continuity of the system requires the production of a differential margin between diachrony and synchrony. And you can see that there, where he's got, he's not a designer, so these are pretty basic, but he's got this kind of they're actually part of one system, even though they seem so divergent. This is not to say that pure play or pure structure cannot be represented or evoked. The former has been depicted in the form of infernal punishments that involve permanent movement and interminable duration. So Playland, Ixion's wheel, Sisyphus' stone. And remember that bit in Pinocchio where in Playland they risk getting turned into donkeys. So there's a kind of diabolical kind of element to this. Whereas the latter, the kind of the synchronic sacred, is imagined through the imagery of perfect, unchanging and blissful heavens. Similarly, because play and ritual both act on unstable signifiers, there are certain proximities, affinities, and crossing points between the two poles, such as funereal and initiatory games, and the appearance of miniatures and toys in tombs. So to summarise, and I'm going to take these kind of like quite abstruse concepts and apply them to games directly now. We've got two temporal directions or movements called diachrony and synchrony. Play tends to produce the former, while ritual produces the latter. In practice, neither is fully achievable. And this impossibility can be seen through these unstable signifiers. These speculations about ritual and toys can be recruited for the analysis of video game temporality by connecting playable game elements with the game's unstable signifiers, points of transformation between the production of synchrony and diachrony. Video game performances act on these signifiers to change their temporal signification. A video game, then, is another apparatus for producing differential margins between diachrony and synchrony. Where such margins once produced initiatory relations between entire generations or helped explain seasonal and cosmic phenomena, computers facilitate the production of increasingly compressed performative feedback loops and intensive fluxes of experience. So a computer can present us with a whole lot of these unstable signifiers, whereas in previous kind of like regimes, they were really rare. So in gaming, we can say that diachrony is produced by apparatuses that separate, disperse, or distinguish performances of a game, making them more distal with respect to one another. Synchrony, on the other hand, is produced by apparatuses that bring together, converge, or concenter performances of a game, making them proximal. And this is the kind of like baseline of how I think we can talk about temporality in games. And then you have these unstable signifiers, which are the crossing points. So probably a really basic example is a fixed dialogue sequence that leads to a binary choice. So you've got this kind of like synchrony, so all performances of this particular game will go through the same sequence of dialogue lines, and then you have this unstable signifier where the player is wondering which way that they're going to go. Each performance is separated from each other. It's a binary choice, and so these are diachronic with respect to one another. However, once the player chooses one of these one of these options, that will then have a synchronic aspect because it will have an effect on all the subsequent choices in the game. So these things are flipping over into each other constantly. So players approach the weft and warp of temporal experience in gaming by attempting to discern what signifiers are unstable and will, as the game proceeds, change their temporal signification. Play proceeds from the will be played, the highly diachronic perspective of the neophyte, to the can be played with, a balance of diachrony and synchrony in the mature play experience, and finally, the will always be played, the end game, where the most signifiers have become highly synchronic. Narrative, for example, can be defined as a highly synchronizing elements in those games with strong storylines. In spite of various differences in how players conduct themselves in the ludic portions of the game, narrative draws the individual performances together through certain events that will occur in every playthrough. And I'd point out before anyone gets mad about talking about narrative, this is a performative account, not an ontological one. Like, I'm not interested in what is play and what is story. It's a comparative account. I'm not kind of entering into that ludology kind of narratology kind of like area, although it might be useful terminology for people who are interested in those arguments. In the course of play, narrative is experienced in highly diachronic terms, Castigliane's narrative anticipation, the question of what happens next. On replay, though, narrative elements generate strong synchronic experience. I've played this before. Chronotypology then uses this comparative method to give a very versatile way of talking about how temporality works. So this is an example that I went to the Backles conference, the British Association of Contemporary Literary Studies, and Dergale Houston, I hope I got that name right, gave this really interesting reading about Enright's The Green Road in the context of how it depicts domestic space as this response to an intensive diachronic event, which is the global financial crisis. in the context of the Celtic tiger and the way that it affected Irish kind of domestic life. This was presented as like this really kind of like strong breakpoint in the way that domestic life signifies itself in Irish life. If you compare this to The Sims, and games will often sell themselves in terms of like being powerful in terms of systems thinking, but The Sims doesn't have the diachronic possibility for representing that kind of exogenous shock. The way that it kind of like, so it has a synchrony, which is it imagines domestic life in a certain kind of way. So you can start to talk about what is outside of these systems using this kind of terminology, which is what is diachronic to their totality. So, and this is where probably this links with Gabrielle's paper as well. One of the most significant synchronies that arise in digital games is the field of gaming itself, what Skellinen terms the gaming situation, or Bullock and Lemieux term the standard metagame. We could also say the ideology of play, to some degree. This is the set of tropes, customs, technical standards, industrial structures, and other shared elements through which digital games are coded primarily as part of consumerist geek culture. Games are often evaluated with this set of values tacitly or overtly in the background. Those which fail to provide sufficient diachronic excitement and thrills are maligned as not games or walking simulators. So Brendan Keogh has talked about this, drawing on the concept of technicity and Dovey and Kennedy's reading of that term. On the other hand, games dealing with serious subject matter, and this is where we come back to Bury Me My Love, they can suffer from expectations that accompany playful experience and activity. The magic circle is a synchronic meta effect in which players know that it is just a game, potentially leavening how they value the in-game representations and simulations. This high-level gaming synchrony can act as an inertial drag on the value of inventive digital games that depart from the norms of the game industry writ large. In the terms developed here, we can say that unstable signifiers through which blockbuster games structure temporality are in fact curiously stable. Similar genres, similar characters, similar interfaces, and so on. So what if we come back to the idea of this reality-inspired game through, and with a specific view to its temporal format? So it uses, in some ways we can say that it synchronizes thousands of refugee narratives. That's its kind of goal, and that's its kind of way of trying to give value to these lives in exile. The game design seeks to, and in another way, the game design seeks to push back against the synchronizing effects of the standard metagame, and thus reintroduce a sense of diachrony that can convey the sense of precarity of seeking refuge. This is done through two main techniques. First, through submerging the game-like unstable signifiers, that is, those that determine diachronic possibilities in the narrative, beneath Noah's characterization and the social media interface. Secondly, through the pseudo-real time progression of the game. So looking at the first point, the depiction of Noah's journey and her interactions with Majd draws on the techniques of mobile and locative gaming more generally, or it mimics them, but assembles these through a mimetic relation to the temporal rhythms of smartphone usage and thus push back against the high-level synchrony of the standard metagame. You can't tell what's ludic and what's kind of like usual social media kind of usage. The game seeks to dissemble in this way any sense of taking place in a magic circle, seated before the typical paraphernalia, mouse, keyboard, monitor, or controller TV set of gaming. Even as a smartphone app, Bury Me My Love in its pseudo-real-time mode emulates the piecemeal on-again, off-again experience of chat, rather than an immersive game. The interface elements are cursory texts, emoji, selfies, and stresses about finding a PowerPoint, none of which are ever very clear on their gameplay functionality. This temporal desynchronization from the standard metagame thus affords Bury Me My Love a powerful sense of diachrony that is also reflected in Nua's determined personality. This is Castiglione to Modern again, this sense of character anticipation, and the possibility that she will lie to Majd or disregard his advice as player character. In one of my playthroughs, Nua refused to don a veil in a Muslim country, even though it may have been safe for her to do so. Sometimes she will message saying she's about to do something really dangerous, or that she lied to Medj because she knew how he would react. Her behaviour is actually governed by 4 variables, which are morale, relationship level with the player character, her budget, and the objects in her inventory. But these are never displayed in-game as ludic kind of interface elements. They're only manifested in various ways through Nua's behaviour. There isn't even a telltale style Nua will remember that to portray the flip from one game state to another. Through the smartphone chat interface and the submerged mechanics then, Bury Me My Love preserves a powerful sense of the instability of its unstable signifiers that allows it to more effectively synchronise with the testimony of Dana in Cecile's Le Mans story than with what we may normally consider the standard metagame. The second powerfully diachronic aspect is the pseudo-real-time structure, which allows the game to diachronically progress in a way that we are now very familiar with, the smartphone notification. Nua's attempts to contact Medj weave into the tasks, communications and updates of daily life, appearing alongside them rather than as a departure therefrom and becoming a part of the harried consciousness of the smartphone user. Often when she's implicated in a task or a situation, she switches to busy mode and no further interaction is possible. The competing stimuli of the smartphone thus become part of the game, helping to convey the anxiety that Medj must be feeling. The forcefulness of this pseudo-real-time design can be compared with the experience of playing the game in fast mode, where there are none of these pauses between interacting with Nua. The feedback loops of the game are immediately much more apparent to players. In this mode, the magic circle and the gaminess of the experience are far more evident. Players encounter Nua as much more of an obvious game character. It is when her messages catch you at different times and in different moods that the typical standard metagame allows her to really begin to feel like a person. Like it's very difficult to convey how different. They may as well be different games, playing this game in different ways. So the game design is already quite capacious with 19 endings, multiple locales and choice points. I think it has about 110,000 words total in it. So there are a lot of possibilities, a lot of diachrony in there. But because if you're playing it in this pseudo real-time mode, your ability to explore that entire possibility space would take years. Okay, so it's kind of like really kind of like pushed back. You can't easily play through it to find every ending of the story. So chronotypology gives us a distinct way to express the effects of these 2 design techniques in Bury Me My Love. In disassembling its interface through social media aesthetics, Nua's willful characterization and the pseudo-real-time progression, Bury Me My Love staves off the most synchronic state in which players look back over a field of unstable signifiers which have been given definitive assignations and clearly represent that will always be played. Cool. I'm going to end on a critical note, and this is in response to some of the other papers that I read at this conference. So there's the question of whether Bury Me My Love uses certain techniques to create political speech leaves aside the question of whether it is effective in doing so. And I think the question of ideology in particular and Feng Zhu's paper are going to talk to these questions that are humming along in the background. So the game won industry coverage and awards. So in spite of its tactical deferral of the standard metagame, it was recognisable enough to be recouped at another level. This perhaps points to its limitations as political speech. And once again, we should heed Gammon's diagnosis that diachrony and synchrony are liable to flip over into one another. As we can see from this tweet, gaming itself is something of an unstable signifier, and many can be horrified at the coincidence of play and serious subject matter. In this light, Bury Me My Love shows that the value of subverting the standard metagame is only really apparent to those who already know what that game is. Thank you.
Thank you, Darshana. We have time for a couple of quick questions.
It's really good. You should play.
So I was quite taken with your point that computers are representing more unstable states, so therefore much more able to present diagrams experience or data diagrams experience. Do you think this applies
So, yeah, and analog games, I guess, more broadly. Yeah. I think, yes, computer games, it is one thing. It's a quantitative shift that's led to a qualitative one. So that the number of kind of unstable signifiers you can present really does change that kind of experience. Because a computer has a memory that far exceeds any human.
Follow to that. How does that relate to analog games that have a vastly greater number of permutations than a computer could? Chess has hundreds of millions of permutations.
Yeah, or Queneau's poems or something like that. Yeah, that's a point, but I think the intensity is the difference here. The intensity at which those transformations can occur is far. You could play chess. Isn't it the recent anniversary of that guy playing 20 chess games at once? That's a lot, but that's small compared to the set of transformations that happens in a video game in a very short period of time. So it can do it, but it depends on the design. And I think if you look at procedural techniques, what they're trying to do is to guarantee as much diachronic experience as possible. But as we saw with No Man's Sky, that can easily be oversold.
Peter?
Yeah, thanks, Darshana. I was curious, do you think this morning's keynote question was, is any of this particular to the artifact of computer games, or is it simply a discussion of ethical intention in relation to any object? The question that's raised by this tweet seems to be exactly that nobody would make that tweet without a book. A book will be a celebrated means, whether fictional or non-fictional, to discuss trauma and difficulty, etc. So do you think that your presentation can add some meaning specificity to the ethical discussion from this morning?
Yeah, I think so. In terms of in that very question of what is the qualitative shift that's happened with the quantitative capacities of computers, there is something to be said there. But I would also point out, there was recently, we have to look at this in terms of, and it's maybe a bit of a mean thing to say about a game that was made by a small studio, but given where the discourse on refugees is, and given that climate change is going to make this problem so much worse, and we have no way of dealing with it at the moment, there was a recent article in Foreign Policy magazine that was looking at the reception of 552, I think it was, Yemeni refugees in South Korea. And they found that even the usually what you might call, and this is obviously inadequate, the progressive wing, there's been this massive outcry about even such a small number of refugees. And they traced it back to the previous Conservative government actually supported Gamergate-like movements in South Korea, which presented all of this misinformation. That's those approaches to social media. So Ryan Milner has this great article called Hacking the Social. They're very ludic, they're very playful, they have nothing to lose. Against that kind of dark play, this kind of question is, is this game a bit early? Are there changes that need to happen in the standard metagame before this can be effective political speech? I think there's a lot of evidence to say that, yes, that's the case.
All right, that concludes our session. So, join me in thanking Darshana.